Hello friends, and welcome back for one more October Halloween horror movie special. I thought today we'd take a look at a few forgotten gems from one of my favorite decades for cinema, the 1940s. If you watched last week's video about horror anthologies, we left off with 1945's Dead of Night from England, a horror anthology that, of course, inspired several Twilight Zone segments, and is still considered a classic both of the anthology genre and the horror genre in general, even today. Now, we don't see too many horror anthologies in the 1940s, but we do have one that's almost a peer to Dead of Night, coming out in theaters a couple years earlier. From 1943, we have the American film Flesh and Fantasy. Now you see a very creepy outline of Edward G. Robinson and Thomas Mitchell's face there. Now, Dead of Night, of course, is remembered as a classic. Flesh and Fantasy is basically forgotten today. Part of that stemming from its very unusual production, where one of the segments for the anthology stories was later re-edited into a movie of its own. So there's pieces of it left, but not enough to justify an entire section, that kind of thing. It's a very bizarre bit. It wasn't done seamlessly either. You can kind of tell there are things that don't belong or things that were cobbled together at the last minute. But with only 3 stories and a sort of kind of framing device, Flesh and Fantasy is still a fun watch. Don't go in expecting Dead of Night, but I think you'll still have fun with what's here. So our framing device is actually taken from Eerie Tales, a German film from shortly after the First World War that we discussed last week. And here are a pair of men, one of whom played by Robert Benchley, I think the other is played by David Hoffman, are reading horror stories to each other. Not so much horror stories, but stories about the supernatural and destiny and fate, because the overall message of Flesh and Fantasy is, are we destined to do things? Are they predetermined? That sort of stuff. So these are much more like Alfred Hitchcock Presents kind of vibes as opposed to Twilight Zone vibes. But our first segment is the one that was kind of salvaged, and I should say, not salvaged, I should say discarded in favor of making a separate feature film, though a few scenes were salvaged. And that tells the story of a young woman who doesn't like her appearance and is given an enchanted mask by a mysterious stranger so she can woo the man she loves, or has at least admired from afar. And yeah, it's an interesting bit set in New Orleans during the Mardi Gras. It's interesting because if you've seen the Twilight Zone episode, The Masks, it's very similar to that. Not so much in tone, but in the idea that a mask changes not just your outward visage, but can actually change your face and reflect your personality, that kind of thing. Robert Cummings, of course, pops up as the man who she's in love with, and he isn't really given too much to do. But Edgar Barrier, as the mysterious stranger, offers this young girl, this mask. It's a mask of a very beautiful woman. Chance to contrast her regular physical appearance. Very interesting stuff, and macabre enough, I think, to be pretty engaging. And there's a good plot twist at the end that I kind of like too. So it's not the best segment in the world, but it does its job. Gets you hooked into the film. And then the second and third segments actually run together. There's overlap. They don't go back to the framing device, which is kind of odd and a little clunky there. But the second segment, the most famous one, based on a story by Oscar Wilde, Edward G. Robinson there is an American living in London. He has his palm read at a party by Thomas Mitchell, who plays a man who could supposedly see the future and read minds, that sort of stuff. And indeed, when several of his bizarre predictions come true for other people, when Robinson asks, "Hey, read my palm," he says he's going to commit a murder. And Robinson's driven almost insane by this, talking to his reflection. There's a really cool scene where his reflection appears twice, little tiny ones in each of the lenses of his glasses. Very interesting segment, very creative there. But he decides he's going to choose, I should say, who he murders, and picks the person, this little old lady he thinks is the least useful of everybody he knows. Gonna bump her off with a poisoned chocolate. But when that plan falls through, as we can predict, he realizes he may have to pick a different victim, and it might not be who we expect. So, very interesting stuff. Edward G. Robinson carries it. Thomas Mitchell isn't given a lot to do, but he's in there enough, I think, that he definitely adds a unique flavor to it. He was Uncle Billy in It's a Wonderful Life, and Doc Boone in Stagecoach, amongst others. Pretty fun stuff. Very ambitious, too. You can tell, much the same way Ivan the Terrible was the main segment of Waxworks, this was definitely the main segment of Flesh and Fantasy. And that overlaps with our final story, a tale featuring Charles Boyer as a tightrope walker who pretends to do his act while inebriated. He has a vision, or a dream I should say, of him falling to his death, and he recognizes Barbara Stanwyck in the audience with these very fancy earrings shaped like little harps. And then that unnerves him so much that he can't go on and do his performance for fear of falling, but when he runs into her on a ship, and, says like, hey, I know you, I've met you, and she's like, no, you haven't, and it's this weird story about how our dreams and reality overlap. It's a little disappointing, and it completely shifts focus and kind of does the reverse, where he starts dreaming about her being in trouble, about halfway or two-thirds of the way through. That's a little disconcerting, but at the end of the day, it does work. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck's good in anything, and Charles Boyer is always fun to watch too. Interestingly, several actors in this, including Robinson, Mitchell, and Boyer, all appeared in the non-horror anthology the previous year, 1942's Tales of Manhattan. Very underrated film. I'd say one of the best anthologies too that isn't, horror or suspense or fantasy or anything like that. I also recommend it on VHS, as this puts the W.C. Fields segment back into the movie instead of having it as a separate supplemental feature. So I like that. But several of these actors already well versed in the art of the anthology film. At the end of the day, it's not a great movie, but I think it does its job. The stories have, enough of a fantasy twist to them to keep you interested. If you're expecting spooks and scares like Dead of Night, you'll probably be disappointed, but flesh and fantasy, pretty fun. And this is the very nice Blu-ray release from Vinegar Syndrome. I treated myself to. Definitely worth the time there. So yeah, if you're looking for more classic anthologies, check that out. I think we'll talk about the segment that was removed from this to be its own feature next Halloween. That's a movie now called Destiny. That kind of thing. We'll talk about that in a year or so, I think. Alright, coming up next. Actually, I should start with the original. Many of you will recognize this movie. If I was your teacher for 9th grade, as I know many current and former students watch my videos for whatever reason, you'll certainly recognize this. Here on my island, I hunt the most dangerous game. So the most dangerous game, based on the short story by Richard Connell, originally known as The Hounds of Zeroff, but everyone remembers it as the most dangerous game nowadays, is a pretty darn good movie from 1932. Very brisk, very fun, very over the top, with Max Steiner's incredibly aggressive musical score that will make you go deaf if you listen to it with headphones. And Leslie Banks, I believe in his film debut, going absolutely ham as Count Zeroff, the man who hunts an animal that is so cunning and so clever, it's more dangerous than any other creature to walk the face of the earth. Spoiler alert, it's people. But anyway, still a pretty compelling movie. Certainly has some shared DNA with King Kong. You can recognize the giant log set from that movie, that kind of thing. But pretty enjoyable stuff. And it only took about a decade for them to realize they could milk this property all over again. From 1945, the remake, or the first remake of many, of course, A Game of Death. A Game of Death follows The Most Dangerous Game pretty closely up until about the last third or so. Indeed, it uses extensive stock footage from The Most Dangerous Game. The boat crash at the beginning, a lot of it's reused here. Various chases through the jungle, a lot of it's reused here. They even use stock footage that has a lot of long shots, so you can still spot Fay Wray, Joel McCrea, Leslie Banks, and so on in Game of Death, even though they're not technically supposed to be there. But they try harder in some places than others to kind of mask when they use stock footage or when they're redoing something almost exactly the same way. Sometimes it kind of works. They might put in an insert here or there to kind of clarify what's going on. But the thing about A Game of Death is that it's kind of the opposite of The Most Dangerous Game. As this is way over the top, this is very subdued. So first of all, the mad Russian Count Zeroff is rewritten as a pseudo-Nazi figure, Erich Krieger. And, well, Leslie Banks eats the scenery and he's really fun to watch. Edgar Barrier, yes, the same Edgar Barrier who popped up here in a benevolent role, plays it very subdued and not as threatening, I think, as he should have. And John Loder is kind of smarmy and smug, and I don't really think that suits the character of Rainsford very well, compared to Joel McCrea, who seemed like a pretty swell guy in The Most Dangerous Game. Here, Rainsford, I guess, has that air of arrogance about him. This one is longer. The original only runs about an hour. This is about an hour and 10, hour 12 minutes or so. Mostly because the other supporting character, Mr. Trowbridge, he is killed off-screen in The Most Dangerous Game, but here we actually see the hunt for him. He's played by Russell Wade. Those of you who are fans of Val Lewton's horror films will probably recognize him. And so he gets an extended kind of chase and death scene, and that's basically where the remaining 10 minutes went. There are also a few changes to the story. Some of the sort of sexual subtext about how a hunter wants to kill an animal, then make love to a woman. That stuff is toned back. There's some of it still here. They even reused that big tapestry with the centaur or gargoyle creature carrying the naked woman, that kind of thing. That's kept in here as a prop. So, you know, basically the same, a few stylistic changes, a few casting changes here and there. I would say overall not as good as The Most Dangerous Game, but still worthy of a watch. It's interesting to see kind of the evolution of this property over time. Of course, there'd be plenty of remakes to follow. Bloodlust, you know, which made it to Mystery Science Theater. There's that, I think it's a Franco film, The Perverse Countess, with a woman in the Zaroff role, that kind of stuff. But interesting to see kind of where the 1940s took the story. Alright, speaking of 1945, one I've been waiting to see, I just got actually as a birthday present not too long ago, The Vampire's Ghost. This was the first writing credit for Leigh Brackett. Leigh Brackett, kind of the queen of science fiction and mystery stories, and she's probably best remembered today for her final film work, this very obscure, unusual science fiction film. I doubt any of you have heard of it. The Empire Strikes Back. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's something people don't watch too much. But yeah, so Leigh Brackett, who had written many stories as she was dying of cancer, she worked on what became The Empire Strikes Back. Most of what she contributed was the basic story outline. A lot of Star Wars reviewers have called it the skeleton of the story. You know, and George Lucas and Lawrence Kasdan kind of took it from there. But this was her first movie writing credit. She wasn't too proud of it, but actually I think for an hour-long cheapo B vampire movie, it's really quite creative and quite fun to watch. John Abbott plays Webb Fallon, this mysterious vampire who runs a little tavern somewhere in backwoods colonial Africa. And yeah, he has some certain vampire traits to him. He has to carry around a box of his grave soil from England in this little container given to him by Queen Elizabeth I. And he does, of course, attack people and turn them into vampires as well, but he's also kind of world-weary and tired. And he seems like a pretty nice guy who's evil, mostly because, predicting movies like Kronos, vampires sort of have to be evil. They have to feed on other people or else they themselves would die, that kind of thing. And he has his eye on our hero's girlfriend and his quest to get her. The Vampire's Ghost is very obviously made on the cheap. You know, they have someone called the African sets looking like they were stolen from a tiki bar, and that's not entirely unfair. Not to mention most of the African-American actors they cast play at least fairly demeaning roles. It's not as bad as some movies of the time, and indeed one of them even gets to be a hero and participate in the vampire's destruction. So it's not terrible, it's not great either. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a fun little movie, mostly worth watching for John Abbott's kind of torn performance as a reluctant vampire who's, you know, tired of living but also doesn't really want to be destroyed either. And it's called The Vampire's Ghost as he dies and is actually resurrected, which is something that's interesting and kind of unique to this. You can tell that Leigh Brackett and company sort of ran with different ideas and combined a few different vampire legends, and at the end of the day, it's a pretty fun little B-movie. I'd recommend checking it out. And let's go back to Edward G. Robinson. We saw this creepy likeness of him on the Flesh and Fantasy box. So now, also from Kino Lorber, as was Game of Death, we have Night Has a Thousand Eyes from 1948. Now, Night Has a Thousand Eyes, it is a song, but that's not what we're here to talk about, is sort of a horror movie, but it's much more of kind of a seance psychic kind of melodrama. And it reminds me a lot of a movie I talked about a couple years ago when I did Halloween films on VHS. It reminds me a lot of 1935's The Clairvoyant with Claude Rains. And The Clairvoyant tells the story of a man who's a stage psychic who discovers he has actual psychic abilities and the various ripples it has in his personal and professional life and the difficulties that it creates. And Night Has a Thousand Eyes runs with that premise quite a bit. Edward G. Robinson is John Triton, the mental wizard, who at first starts as a phony psychic, but then realizes he has actual psychic abilities. and can predict many tragedies, that kind of thing. And the biggest of which is saving his best friend's daughter, played by Gail Russell. She'd be in The Uninvited and one of my favorite John Wayne movies, Angel and the Bad Man. Saving her from the death that he has foresaw for her, that kind of thing. Indeed, it opens with her attempting suicide to avoid all this drama, but he talks her out of that and does his best to help her, dealing with skeptical police officers, including one played by William Demarest, of all people, and just trying to figure out how he can use this gift to help people, that sort of thing. So it borrows quite a bit from The Clairvoyant, which of course came out of England, shortly before the British horror movie ban, I believe, or certainly right around that time. The Clairvoyant has that the stage mentalist's fake psychic powers stem from the way the questions are framed. An audience member, or the helper, I should say, takes an item from the audience member and asks, what is this? And that means a certain type of object, versus what do I have in my hand would mean a different object, that kind of thing. And then he has an actual psychic moment where he, out of nowhere, predicts something real for somebody, in this case the contents of a letter in their bag. Similar in tone, we have Nightmare Alley from the 1940s. I think we'll talk about this next year when we go over Criterion stuff. And that has a fake psychic using the way the questions are enunciated, the way the syllables are stressed, that sort of thing. It's like a secret code that a person can use to decipher what the person in the audience has, that kind of thing, what the helper's holding up. And then this movie uses something kind of similar. It has background music being played as he does his psychic predictions, and then the song that the piano player, played by Jerome Cowan, is playing. It helps to give him clues as to what the object from the audience is, that kind of thing. And then, just like in The Clairvoyant, Robinson is an actual psychic moment. It's very stagey, it's very melodramatic, but it is kind of a fun, interesting watch too, and does a lot with that psychic kind of idea. And I enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it there. It's a pretty underrated one. And lastly, I thought I'd throw one more in, just for good measure. Let's talk some Stooges horror. We've talked about the Spook Louder DVD before, because the problem is it's marketed as a Stooges horror film DVD, and it really isn't. Of course, we have Spook Louder with Mo Leary and Curly, the only one with Curly as the third Stooge on the disc. Spook Louder, they are in charge of watching over an inventor's house while he's in Washington, demonstrating his death ray, and 3 enemy agents show up. There's some anti-Japanese rhetoric, it's definitely a product of World War II. Some fun gags, but a lot of running around, a lot of the Stooges screaming and running in circles and reacting to stuff. Some people like it, some people don't. It's one of those Stooges shorts. If I'm in just the right mood for something ridiculous like that, I can have a great time with it. If not, it's a little bit grating. I do like the beginning, though, where they're going door to door selling their weight loss reduction machines, which apparently involve electrocuting your clients, that kind of thing. Interesting stuff there. For horror shorts, we also have Shivering Sherlocks, where the Stooges helping frequent Stooges leading lady, Christine McIntyre, with a house that she's inherited, and not realizing bank robbers have kind of set it up, including Duke York as Angel, the hatchet murderer who looks kind of like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. This is mostly remembered for that performance. The Stooges would remake it in the 50s as Of Cash and Hash, which is much better in my opinion. We also have The Ghost Talks, where they run afoul of a possessed suit of armor in an old castle. One of my least favorite Shemp original shorts. The Ghost Talks was also remade in the mid-50s as Creeps, and Creeps definitely plays up the horror angle, I think is a much better experience. The Ghost Talks has some good gags, but not a big favorite of mine. Hocus Pocus involves them meeting Sven Garlick, the mysterious mentalist there who can supposedly hypnotize people. David Bond as Sven Garlick is really good. He has eyeballs drawn on his hands and does all these weird over-the-top motions. He played Jack the Ripper in one of the best Twilight Zone hour-long episodes, The New Exhibit, which is quite fun. I like Hocus Pocus, though. It turns out the Stooges end up foiling an insurance scam through getting involved with this hypnotist. And then we have 2 that aren't really horror-related. Fright Night, despite the name, is a boxing story. No doubt a spoof of Fight Night, that kind of thing. But Fright Night is fun, and it has Dick Wessel as their boxer, and he's really good and has good chemistry with the Stooges. Some good gags and chase scenes. Don't really know why it's here, though. Not sure. And then, of course, we have Mummy's Dummies, which also, despite the name, isn't necessarily a horror story, as it's set in ancient Egypt, and there's a scene where Shemp dresses as a mummy, but mummies don't really play into the story there. It is a funny one though. They pull the Pharaoh, played by Vernon Dent, pull his tooth as it's killing him, that kind of thing. But I think they meant to include We Want Our Mummy, where the Stooges travel to Cairo to find a lost professor and discover some Egyptian tomb robbers, that kind of thing. Wish they'd included that instead. Alright, and that wraps up our 2024 Halloween films here. What are some of your favorite horror films of the 40s? Please comment below. And I think we'll see you next time. We'll be back to music here pretty soon, folks, so don't distress. Have a good one.